I'd like to look at powers and square roots in this particular topic, and sometimes powers of higher order as well. But first off, let's just talk about what powers actually are. So powers are things where basically it means that we times something by itself. It could be times it by itself once, or do it over and over and over again. As an example, 2 to the power of 2 means that I have to times 2 together twice. 2 times 2, which is equal to 4. If I did 2 to the power of 4 this time, I have to times it by itself 4 times. Oops, 4 times. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is equal to 16. So that's what a power means. When you see something with a power, you just have to times it out by however many times you see in the power. This can also be done with algebra terms. Something like a to the power of 5 would be a times by itself 5 times. A times a times a times a times a. So that's what we imply by powers. And on your calculator, there's a few buttons that you would use for this. Depending on which version you have, this is for squaring. And this is something that you would use where you hit that button and you'll see a little box appear. So you'll see like 3 and a little blank box, and you put in another number. And that's what we would use for anything bigger than 2. So for instance, 3 to the power of 7, you would type in the 7 there. On the other calculator, the older version, you use these two things to do a power of like 3 to the power of 7. Here you would actually type in 3, that little caret key. It looks like an upside down caret, and 7, and that will get you your answer. But a lot of basic powers you should be able to do in your head. And squares are numbers that are really important for us to know. So let's think about what they are. 1 squared, that's 1 times 1 is 1. 2 squared is 4. 3 squared is 9. 4 squared is 16. 5 squared is 25. 6 squared is 36. 7 squared is 49. 8 squared is 64. 9 squared is 81. And 10 squared is 100. You can keep going, but those first basic squared numbers from 1 to 10 are really important to just be able to recognize, because we'll end up using them a lot in mathematics throughout the next few years. So a squaring number, again, is just you times it by itself, and basically that works out. So for instance, this is 2 times 2 again. Now taking a square root is kind of like doing the opposite. It's trying to undo the square. It's trying to undo what you did in the first place. And one way to think about that is, what number would you have to square to get it? So let's work backwards. If I asked you, and square roots look like this, if I asked you for the square root of 16, I want you to think backwards. What number squared, so what number times itself, would equal 16? And you can see that 4 times 4 is going to get you 16. So the square root of 16 is 4. It's undoing it. It's looking back in time to see what number you would times by itself to get what's under the root. Now your buttons for this one are here. These are your roots, your square root, and also here on the newer calculator. So sometimes square roots are numbers that you can know from these basic squares. So for instance, the square root of 36 would be, well, what times itself gets you 36? That is in fact 6. So you're undoing it, working backwards. Square root of 100. Again, 10 times 10 will get you 100, so the square root there is 100. And you can plug it into your calculator to figure out what it is, because I might give you a really nasty number like the square root of 79. And you'd have to work it out, possibly in a calculator, to figure out what the number is. It'll be some scary looking decimal. So the ones that you can do in your head are really important, and that's mostly just the basic squares of 1 to 10, maybe 11, 12, numbers like that. But they're important to get your head around. Next thing would be to look at how these apply to fractions. Because it's quite easy to think about, if I gave you 37 squared, you would know that that's 37 times 37. But fractions can also be scary, so what happens if I give you 1/2 and I say 1/2 squared? What I want you to do is actually apply the power to both the top and the bottom of the fraction. So this becomes 1 squared over 2 squared. 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, so 1/2 squared becomes 1/4. So you apply it to the top and the bottom. As another example, we could look at 3 over 5 squared, and again we apply the square to both the top and the bottom, so that's going to be 3 squared on top. Let's save writing it out. Let's think about this. It'll be 3 squared on top, so that's 3 times 3, which is 9. And it'll be 5 squared on the bottom, and 5 times 5 is 25. So that's how those would work out. Now in your calculator you can do it as well, just make sure you put brackets around the fraction before you put it in there. What about a number like, let's do this, 1 over 3, do 2 over 3. 2 over 3 to the power of 3. Well, if a squared number is timesing it by itself twice, the power of 3, taking it, cubing it, is going to be timesing it by itself 3 times. So this was going to become 2 times 2 times 2 over 3 times 3 times 3. So 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8. And 3 times 3 is 9 times 3 is 27. So your answer for that would be 8 over 27. And similar tactic will apply if I gave you a number like 49 divided by 64, and I want you to take the square root of it. I want you to think about taking the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom separately. So the square root of 49 would be 7, because 7 times 7 gets you 49. And the square root of 64 would be 8, because 8 times 8 gets you 64. So again, you apply it to the top and the bottom. And if you have other powers, same things will apply. Just remember that the power tells you how many times you have to times the number by itself. So again, something like 3 to the power of 4 would be 3 times 3 times 3 times 3, 4 times, and you'd have to times it out. 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, times that last 3 is 81. So keep those in mind. Most of these you should be able to do in your head, but do start to play with your calculator a little bit to get familiar on how to use those buttons as well.